Today's topic is sewing curves and darts. The reason we use curves and darts is we need to shape the garment to the human body. Okay, so a curved seam provides shaping by taking two pieces and putting them together. Princess seams are found in both men's and women's clothing. You can also have curved seams if you have a yoke on a garment, at the neckline, or even the armhole of a garment. Those are places you find curved seams. Okay, the important things to know. One, sew curves slowly because you're not really sewing in a straight line. So just like when you sew a corner, you need to stop the machine, put the needle down, lift the presser foot, and adjust your fabric. Put your presser foot back down and continue sewing for a few bits. Curves can be inward, what we call concave. That would be sewing a neckline or sewing an armhole. Curves can be convex. That would be anytime you're sewing a circle. That could be a pillow cover. It could be a beret, a type of hat you wear on your head. Or they can be a combination where you're sewing a concave side to a convex side. Gets a little complicated there. If you look at the top of your shaped mask, over the cheeks, you're stitching a concave curve, and over the nose, you're stitching a convex curve. So you have a combination that creates the cheek to the nose to the cheek. And so we're going to talk about that. All right, so let's start with concave curves. All right, this is an example of a neckline and sewing a facing to the neckline. So if you look at most clothing, t-shirts don't count, all right? But most dress clothing, they don't have a raw edge at the end. They're not just serged. They have a part that turns back to the inside. And the part that turns back to the inside is called the facing, okay? So you can have a facing on a neck edge, you can have it on an armhole, or you can have a complete lining in the garment. That is an example of a curve that is concave. It curves in. After you sew a concave part of a curve, you need to clip the seam allowance. You clip the seam allowance so that when you turn it to the inside, it can spread further apart. So you will need to clip the concave portion of the seam on your mask. A convex curve goes to the outside, so that's like sewing a circle. Okay, so when you sew that circle, once you have to notch the seam allowance. And the reason you notch the seam allowance is when you turn it to the inside, it actually has to get smaller instead of spreading out. Okay, so you will notch the part of your seam allowance that goes over the nose because that is part of the convex curve of your mask. It also keeps it, if you don't notch it out, it gets a little bulky in there because it's trying to compress and get smaller. So that's why we do that rather than just clipping. If you just clip on a convex curve, it creates little folds in the fabric, which makes it bulky. Okay, so now you have to sew a convex curve to a concave curve. Ah! All right, so on the left you have an example of a center front part of a bodice or vest and a side front. So what you're seeing from the left, you have the center front. In the middle, you have where the two fit together. Notice when they're laying down, they're great. They're going to match right up. And on the far right, you have a side seam. But the problem is you have to put those right sides together. And when you lay them out right sides together, you get the picture in the middle where one is convex and one is concave. How do you sew those together? One, you have to match the ends. So you match the top of your curve and the bottom of your curve. Two, you have to match your notches. Most seams have points where you know they match, and those are where they are notched. As you work with your patterns, you're going to be having patterns that have notches on them. 3, you have to match the stitch line to the stitch line. So it's very important that you take your time when you're pinning a curve to make sure that your stitch lines match. On the far right, you see what it looks like when you've matched those two seams together. Right now, they're sitting there, they're both wrong side out. You'll notice that one lays flat and the other one lays all lumpy. Now in theater, we're very hesitant at this point to clip and notch because we never know if we're going to have to adjust that costume to fit another actor. If you have just a little bit of seam allowance, say a ½ inch of seam allowance, usually you can press that to the convex side. Okay, you can press it to the convex side. I think I said that right. What you want is you want one to fold in on itself and one to lay flat. If you fold it the other way, the concave side won't spread. The problem is the concave side doesn't spread. It can't get bigger unless you clip it. But the convex side can fold on itself. It's a little bit more bulky, but at this point, like I said, we need to be able to alter the garment to fit somebody else. And as soon as you clip or notch those seams, you can't let them out because there's no seam allowance to release because it's got all these cuts in it. So that's something there. You have to press your curves. Okay, so we've always said stitch a seam, press a seam, stitch a seam, press a seam. So even with most curves, you've got to press them open. On the princess seam, we tend to press it to one side so we can do that. If we're never going to alter the garment, we will press that seam open. This is an example of a convex curve because it's been notched that is being pressed open before it's turned to the right side. The easiest way to press a curve is to use what we call a pressing ham. And if you look at it, it looks just like a canned ham, only it's a little bit soft. It's made out of fabric stuffed with a material that's much like sawdust. It's got a hefty weight to it. You can stand the ham up on different ends. You can stand it on the fat end, on the skinny end, or on a side, or just lay it flat on its back. What you'll find is the skinny end mimics a shoulder, so it's good for pressing shoulder seams. The fat end is really good for pressing bust-lined seams, as is the side of it. If you lay it on its side or you just go over the top, that's really good for doing sort of a men's doublet. Okay, that's a great way to lay that out and get a nice seam on your curved seams. Okay, so we use the pressing ham when we are pressing our curves. Okay, so now let's talk about darts. Historically, curves came first, then darts. But the purpose of a dart is to take just a flat, two-dimensional piece of fabric and be able to create folds in it so it fits the three-dimensional human form. Much like pleats, but different from pleats. And the difference is that a pleat is a rectangle. A dart creates a triangle or a diamond. Sometimes our darts might have a slight curve to them, and that is fine. That is advanced. Okay, that is advanced. So when we have a double-pointed dart that is curved, we often call it a banana dart because it looks like a banana when you lay it on its side. Okay, so a dart is a triangle or a diamond that you sew into the fabric so it creates the two-dimensional into the three-dimensional. Okay, there's your triangle. What you will have, generally speaking, is you find the center of your triangle first. Okay, first you find the center. Then you find the two sides. So you know where the fabric needs to release from, and you know how much smaller it needs to be on the edge, okay? There is a correct and a wrong way to stitch a dart. You always want to start stitching at the fat part of your triangle and stitch towards the pointed end. When you get to the end, you can back stitch at the fat side, but when you get to the end of your dart, you want to just sew off of the fabric, okay? Oftentimes what I will do is I'll do 2 or 3 stitches right along the edge of the fabric before I start. What you don't want to do is stop before you finish your triangle. That's going to leave a little pucker in your fabric. Don't backstitch at the point of your triangle. Notice this one, you can see there's a slight curve to the dart. What you want to do is you want to take your threads and you want to hand tie a knot in them. Some people will thread them into a needle and sew a knot like you do with hand sewing. Some people will just take the 2 pieces of thread and tie a knot together in them. Either way, that's good. And then, of course, the last thing we do is we need to press our dart. So first you want to press your dart into its half triangle shape so you get a nice crisp edge on it. And then you're going to press your dart to what we call towards the outside. So if your dart is at the front of the body, you want to press it towards the sides of the body. Okay, so if it's on the right side underneath the bust, you would press it towards the outside of the garment, away from the center of the body. Okay, that's what to the outside means, away from the center of the body. And that is sewing curves and darts.